Okay, welcome. Good afternoon. I think we'll kick off. I'm Lara Potter, ACE's Chair of Future Skills Group, and I work with Arcadis. Welcome to this Future of Consultancy webinar on pricing and getting the best from consultants. These webinars are part of the Future of Consultancy themed webinars, and these virtual events include episodes including pricing, roles and services, and some of you may have joined our previous webinars, so you'll be used to the format already. In previous webinars, we've covered future risk and delivery models, and today we're very lucky to have a panel of experts for you, including Hannah Vickers, CEO of ACE, Emma Jane Houghton at the Cabinet Office, and Neil Thompson of Centre for Digital Built Britain. But before we kick off, just a few housekeeping rules. We could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Firstly, please, if you have any questions, send them directly to the panelists via the chat box, and your questions will remain anonymous. Please, no question is too daft. If you have a question, please ask it in the chat box, and we'll answer those at the end. We'll try and answer as many as possible, but don't worry, we'll also answer any others we haven't had a chance to cover during the webinar, and we'll answer those after the webinar. We'll be able to send you the recording and the presentation slides after this webinar, so that everybody can access them after the event. I think that's all of the housekeeping rules. So let's get going. Firstly, I am delighted to welcome our first speaker, Hannah Vickers, Chief Executive of the Association for Consultancy and Engineering. So over to you, Hannah. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Lara. So I'm going to kick off just to give a bit of narrative around how the consultancy industry is changing. And this is meant to then frame things for the other speakers who will talk a little bit more about how to get the best and some of the technical details behind that. But I'm going to give some general overview of how the market is shifting for consultants and therefore what that means, particularly if you're looking to buy from us as an industry. So if I can have the next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the drivers of change. So what is it that's actually disrupting us? What is it that's changing our working environment as consultants? So the first one won't be a surprise. I don't think any of them will be a surprise, to be honest, but the first one particularly won't. It's all around data and digital. So Neil will talk much more eloquently than I will about this later on, but effectively that is massively disrupting how we work. It's disrupting not just what we do for clients in terms of the breadth of services offered, but also how we deliver it. So you can have some really quite impressive productivity improvements by embracing digital technology, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. So secondly, there's been a big shift in what clients are asking of us, so the demand. So again, net zero features very heavily in this, and that won't be a surprise to you. But also things like the levelling up agenda will change who our clients are. You know, we'll be working more with local authorities, with LEPs, we'll be working a lot more directly or a lot more closely to the end users. So that in turn is shifting what we do as an industry. And finally, I've touched on it a little bit there, but devolution and levelling up, that is changing who we engage with, because as you devolve spending and decision-making powers down to the regions or further into the devolved nations, it means that we will be talking to different people about different projects as well. So if you combine those three, there is quite a lot happening around us as an industry that is causing us or giving us the opportunity to shift and change what we do. Have the next slide, please. So if I just focus in at the moment on digital transformation, because that I think is what we're going to focus on particularly today when we talk about buying, you can see here a very simplistic diagram that just starts to show you what that actually means. So traditionally we've been a people-based industry. We are professional services. We are, selling staff or the products of staff, but predominantly delivered by people. Now, as we shift to the future, you can hear my dog in the background joining the webinar now. As we shift to the future, and the opportunity that we have through digital transformation is to develop a blended offer. So we will still be relying very heavily on our people and their expertise, but we'll actually be able to supplement that by products and technology solutions, and also the access to a huge amount more data than perhaps we have been able to either gather or interrogate before. So what we're looking at going forward is a combined offer of those three things. Now, we'll come back to this later on, but you can start to see from that actually what's happening and why we might need to sort of shift the commercial terms with which we actually engage with clients. So return to that one later on, but just to give you some food for thought for now. If I could have the next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about what that means in terms of what we're selling to clients. So you can see here on the right, you've got a very simplistic representation of our different markets. So the top left-hand corner, you've got what we class as the strategic advisory. So where we are working, offering sort of solution definition, quite strategic interventions before you have a project, if you like. So things that work at a kind of strategy level, things that are focused on understanding your needs as a client, understanding what the right intervention is. So that's the top left-hand point of this. In the bottom is what you'll probably know as best for doing, which is the project level interventions. So there we will have some of the more traditional kind of professional services for construction that we do, but being delivered in a different way, maybe being more productive, maybe being able to offer deeper analysis and insights. But also, interestingly, on at a project level, I think we'll be doing more in terms of services that are sort of non-construction delivery, so getting clients the same outcomes but without actually constructing something, or constructing something much smaller. So there is a shift even in our traditional markets around what we do. And then at the top right, you've got operations advisory, which again, we have been in this market previously, but now with the opportunity to sort of aggregate data sets and do much better modeling and interrogation, we can offer a lot more value to clients in that top right hand side. So if you like, we are changing what we're doing in the bottom green part, but also kind of expanding the services that we offer in the top two purple parts. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. The next one, thanks. So if that was what we're selling, there's obviously a shift in terms of how we deploy our resources. So just to kind of touch a little bit on our ways of working as useful context around why we need to kind of shift what you're buying as clients. So here are sort of 4 categories, and they're not exhaustive, but it's just to be illustrative at this point, around how we might deliver for you. And some of the changes that we'll see as a result of those disruptors I mentioned at the start of my presentation. So the first one is client augmentation. This is probably what you might know as a kind of secondment model, sending people in, putting them into client organisations to actually supplement your team with expertise or with capacity. Now, that is something that we will continue to do in future, but we will have a much broader range of skills and capabilities, perhaps in areas that are kind of new to the market, new to the client. So we'll be able to bring in expertise along those lines. Moving then to products and services, again, this is around existing service lines. It could be things like detailed design, it could be provision of reports for the planning process. But all of those will be disrupted or changed in terms of how we deliver them digitally. You can have digitally enabled design being much more productive than a traditional design process, but also more value adding in terms of the modelling, the simulation, and the sort of construction planning that you'll be able to do. And equally, there'll be new things that we'll be able to bring to the market as products and services, products and solutions. One of those that I'm quite excited about is the opportunity to, I think, do something around a virtual business case. So whereas historically you've had very sort of flat paper-based business cases, I actually think there's something really interesting about consultants being able to offer something which is a bit more dynamic in terms of a business case to support client decision making and better optioneering and modelling. So independent review, independent assurance, you might know it as, again, even that will be disrupted to a certain extent because of the plethora of data. We'll be able to do a lot more with benchmarking and modelling and analysis and comparisons than perhaps we've done previously. So, although it might stay as quite a traditional service, the quality and the value that's added has the real opportunity to sort of scale that up and have a lot more impact. And then lastly, one which I think we don't really do at the moment, but actually selling direct to the public. So whilst we're kind of amassing that knowledge and insight through digital transformation, there is a huge opportunity to be able to sell that direct to the public in a way that we haven't done before. There are things that we can sort of package up in apps, in public information services that, again, we sort of 20 years ago wouldn't have even been an option for us, but actually we have that as a route to market now, which would in turn generate revenue for the consultancy business. So just a bit of insight there around some of the changes around some of our more traditional, but also some of the newer service lines that we might be bringing to market. So final slide, if I could have the next one from me. So all of that, and I don't want to steal Emma Jane's thunder here, but all of that really sets you up for needing quite a different relationship between the clients and the market. So you'll see here we've got the rewards models that you will be aware of. These are not different models, but I think what we are looking at here is shifting how you select them to make sure that you are actually getting the best out of the market. We do predominantly at the moment use input, certainly on public sector hours-based models, going more towards output lump sum or having some element of outcome performance-based fee is not only possible because we'll have better benchmarking, we'll have better data to be able to understand it and be able to sort of have confidence in demonstrating that performance enhancement. It also means that we're able to create a return on investment. So you'll see on the right of this slide, and back to that diagram I used at the start of the presentation, which effectively says if you stick to hours-based contracts, there is no way for the suppliers to make a return on investment for the data or the products themselves. So I think that's a sort of health warning I would leave you with to close my presentation, that says basically if you're sticking with hours-based, there's not anything necessarily wrong with that, but it will only access part of our capability going forward. And I think clients should be going into that with their eyes wide open around what they're actually wanting to buy and what the capability of the industry has compared to perhaps what it would have had sort of 10, 20 years ago. So that was it from me. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and debate when we get going, but I hope that's useful to kick us off, Lara.
Hannah, thank you so much for that framework to just sort of help us orientate ourselves through these changes. It's really, really helpful. I'm particularly interested in sort of the comments around how consultants drive a much broader definition of value, bringing in the sort of net zero and social outcomes agenda as well. So thank you very much for that. Right, I'd like to move on now and introduce Emma Jane Houghton, who's Commercial Director for the New Hospitals Programme at the Cabinet Office. She won't be commenting specifically on the hospitals programme, but will be delighted to take questions on client approaches. And Emma Jane, we're absolutely delighted to have you here today. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Oh, thank you, Lara. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to talk a little bit about my thoughts on how clients change their commercial approach, on what we think the enablers are. And if we think back to Hannah's last slide, I think that's an excellent segue in terms of what I would like to talk about here. So this is all about how we move away from the predominance and the default of inputs and hours-based approaches to outputs, to outcomes and incentives. So I suppose my starting point here was to think about the sort of commercial structuring, because that's where your sort of brain goes to when you think about this. What should that reward model look like? How is it structured? How do we get the maths to work in terms of incentives in that new consultancy reward model? And that is a really critical consideration if consultants are to be incentivised to go to market in new and more effective ways in line with the Future of Consultancy agenda. But this moving away from the rudimentary sort of input and time-based models to output and outcome product-based reward models is an essential part of building the right pull factors. It's really important, but it is not the only factor to consider. So I wanted to take perhaps just a small step back, not beyond the sort of thinking of the commercial approach, but just a slight step back from before we design that actual model, and think about something which is quite often forgotten in terms of that commercial approach from a clienting perspective, but is absolutely necessary if we're going to break down the barriers to putting in place these new and improved reward models. I've thought about my experience as a consultant, and I've thought about my experience as a client, and I think this bit that I'm going to talk about is probably the hardest area to crack. And this area is really simply put, it's the approach that the client takes. So specifically those keys to unlocking how a client can conceive, how it can advocate, and how it can put through its own governance a performance-based pricing model that is able to focus on quality of outputs and of outcomes. And in my experience, I think there are three main areas that clients could focus on better and put more attention into if they are able to then run with these performance-based reward models. And those three areas are: 1, know thyself, 2, have a plan, and 3, enable the expertise. So I'll make a few comments on these three areas to sort of tee it up, but absolutely welcome debate and further questions when we get to that point in the webinar. So the first area, know thyself. So this is about a client knowing who it is, knowing who you are. It's understanding the role that you can and want to play in the delivery. And this will link through to other webinars that have been put forward, and indeed the one that was run last week by Tim, which is all about picking the right delivery model and understanding your role in it. So that's not to repeat what was said there, but it's to understand that actually that translates into the design of the commercial model itself, because this is about gearing up to undertake that role effectively. And only that role, actually, not any other role, but specifically that role that you've landed on, regardless of any clienting legacy or any specific personalities in that client. And critically, I think, taking the optimal position of control and the reward model to match it, because if the control position within that clienting model is a mismatch with the reward model you seek, then the whole thing falls over and it doesn't work. So say, for example, we have worked out as a client that we need lots of innovation and that we need the market to participate in that space, so therefore we need to incentivize the market to work with us and consultants to put brains together and come up with something new in this new space that we are targeting. If we were to run with an input-based model that is high on control, we do not create the right space for that to happen. So this is about thinking really carefully about that control lever and then gearing up the commercial model and your clienting response in a way that is optimal. The second area is about having a plan. So this is probably the area that frustrates me the most, more so I would say in my consulting experience. And it's this sort of classic, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And often I think what happens, I'll be quite critical of this, I think there isn't a plan, there isn't a strategy, there's a sort of panic moment where you think nothing's happening, and then there's a rush to market to get people, get bodies and get stuff in and happening, any old thing sometimes. And of course that's not optimal because there is no strategy and there is no approach. And so I think on reflection, having a plan doesn't have to be the most perfect plan, but driving that plan, not trying to make it a static and perfect thing and allowing that plan to evolve over time, just philosophically is a really important point for a client to consider. And then the third area, enabling the expertise. So I think it's a little bit linked to the first point around control. The more a client can think it is there to enable the right brains and the right expertise, whether that be people, tools, data, or other products, to come forward into the mix and to succeed in the way that it wants around the outcomes that it's defined, and create the best environment, workflows, and setup to make that happen. The more the consulting market will be able to really drive that productivity and really bring those innovations forward. So not quite the sort of nuts and bolts of reward models. I'm very happy to get into the detail of those, but for me, these three areas are absolutely a part of that commercial approach. And the more we start to think of it in that way, the better equipped clients will be to create that pull factor that is needed to set these new reward models up for success. Thank you, Lara, back to you.
Absolutely wonderful, Emma Jane. Thank you so much. Great insights from the client perspective, and I particularly liked your example about aligning your reward models. If you're really wanting innovation, if you control it too much, that's not what you get. So, and I think a lot of consultants and clients will have examples exactly to demonstrate that. Thank you very much, Emma Jane. Last but certainly not least, and please put your questions into the chat. I'm sure you've all got questions that have come up since Emma Jane and Hannah have been talking. But I'm now going to introduce Neil Thompson, who is head of the Construction Innovation Hub at the Centre for Digital Built Britain. That's quite a mouthful, and also a director of digital at Atkins. Neil, welcome and thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you. So next slide. So what I'm going to cover some mega trends that kind of, I'm just thinking about the sort of the things that were being said previously. There's some things that from a technology perspective that enable us to achieve those types of concepts. So I'm just going to go through some things that are happening out there. So we've also got this might seem a bit cliche, but we have the internet, and it's gone through these generations. And what's sort of referred to as the third platform, I'm proposing there's a fourth. So to wind back slightly, in the first iteration of the internet, we connected mainframe computers together, connected millions of people to thousands of apps, and that grew into the second platform, which is sort of the World Wide Web. We could sort of connected hundreds of millions of people and tens of thousands of apps. And this was sort of the beginning of, the creation of Amazon and all those types of things. We get into the third platform. This is kind of where most of our experience of the internet is today. So this is more of sort of the internet that's enabled by mobile devices. So we've connected most people on the planet to millions of applications and represented by your mobile phone. And what I'm suggesting here is on the fourth platform, which has begun with the Internet of Things, but which has connected sort of tens of billions of things to the internet. As we sort of go through and connect to, what I sort of refer to as, let's connect the rest of the built environment to the internet. We have the potential of connecting trillions of things, and the interconnections of trillion things means that there's going to be an order of magnitude higher of connections that can be made, which sort of represents unique levels of insight. So that's, the extensibility of the internet and where that's going is a key enabler for what's been discussed previously. Next slide. What I call the Ubiquitous Technology Zoo. And what I mean by that is, a lot of technology already exists, and this spectrum here is sort of all the way up into what we call Earth observation technology. There's quite a lot that we can detect passively from space, it being images all the way through to understanding sort of types of radio waves that emit from the Earth's surface, which can do some interesting things around asset condition monitoring, for example. And the price of that is becoming quite cheap now relative to how it was previously. All the way down to the ground, where we're looking at the application, we say the mobile phones and all the applications that come with that, the role of autonomous unmanned vehicles, for example, all the way through to the application of augmented reality on site. All these things are there. I mean, if we just look at the capability of technology in the consumer space and applying that to augmenting our business models is quite interesting. If we look at the expectation of the digital citizen from their own personal perspective, I think all the things that happen in your personal lives around technology, and compare that to what happens in your professional sphere. Is there a gap? Is there a way that could be closed? All the technology, I guess what I'm saying is that the technology pretty much exists. It's only existed in a very short period of time. We're only talking about 3 to 5 years. But it exists now to be able to augment that into business processes. So it's more about a process design and culture perspective. Next slide. Which we're getting deeper into. So the economics of this is that, we've got the cost of compute, the cost of storage for those computers, the cost of accessing those from a cloud perspective, the internet connections are all reaching really low levels. I call it a consumer level. It's almost a commoditized consumer service, and the outcome of that is, essentially the cost of prediction is reducing incredibly quickly. And what I mean by the application of artificial intelligence and being able to have some level of predictability in data is, you can jump on a Google Cloud course now and do feature recognition on pictures yourself in a couple of hours, and it'll cost you nothing. And then the last one, I think this is the thing that's key that goes into the mix in terms of construction industry, is we look at the rate of labor costs against the cost of robotics. We've reached an interesting point where robotics are, we're not a million miles away from being able to have we have autonomous lawnmowers in B&Q. We're not a million miles away. We're sort of maybe 5 years, maybe 10 at a push to have collaborative robotics sold in B&Q. There's a little prediction for you, and what impacts that has in terms of moved from hammering nails, screwing screwdrivers in with screws, to power drills, to robotic arms with different attachments on. That sort of maturity from a robotics perspective, and these things create a perfect storm for us with those costs reaching near consumer levels. Next slide. And we talk about business models and today and tomorrow, but these things. I mean, if we look at the music industry, and even now, I mean, the data on here from the FT is a little bit out of date, but you could imagine the moving over to streaming services in the media and entertainment world is accelerated even faster in the pandemic. I think an interesting thing here to be considerate of is, you know, sometimes we talk about what's going to be the Spotify of construction, but an interesting thing happened in the music industry. You know, you had to work out how to record music digitally first before you can sell music digitally, and that process happened in sort of like the late 70s, early 80s. So, you know, and this predates that. You know, think about the business models here about the physical music and and how that shifted over to streaming, but you know, that flip over to digitally recorded music happened in way left side of this graph, but the actual business model impact didn't happen till much later. And you'd probably see that my layers of the platforms of the internet, that across time against this model is quite interesting. You know, around 2010 was that inflection point of the business model starting to change and focus more on a digital delivery perspective. And I believe we're at a very similar place if we swap physical another with, I don't know, fixed price contracts and I don't know, PPP projects or what have you. You know, we can see that there's these models that are going to emerge. Next slide. But this thing about technology is not without consequences. You know, just because we can embed technology into everything, should we? There will be an ecological disaster if we're going to embed sensors into every single piece of every item in the built environment. You know, if I was to put sensors into all my walls, what does that mean from you know, the raw materials required to make that technology? And I guess my example is with Bitcoin, for example. You know, Bitcoin's reaching a point where it's dealing with a particular problem, but an unintended consequences to how resource intensive that is from a computing perspective. You know, starting to consume as much energy as a small country, which is interesting. And lastly on that, you know, I've got the number of deaths by risk factor for the world in 2017, and air pollution, outdoor air quality is a key is a key outcome from the outcomes of creating cheap and accessible cars. It's just one example. I know the pollution impact is much broader than just cars, but you know, pointing engineers towards can we make these units of travel as cheap and accessible as possible has meant that roads are congested and polluted. You know, changing the focus of the design process is really key. So there's these consequences to think of. And finally, my next slide. Yeah, there's some good news, and an interesting thing has happened from behaviors of people in the internet, which I'm going to use as a proxy of people being empowered by data, means that, you know, the relative search interest in the UK shifted from me trying to find the cheapest thing to me trying to find the best thing, the best quality thing. And I think this is a key thing that can happen in our industry as we've, you know, the technologies that I've spoken about previously coming together with, you know, the dynamics that Hannah's presented is, you know, we can move away from the cheapest thing to buying the best thing. And that, you know, I think it's no mistake. Sorry, it's no coincidence that, you know, that inflection point has happened in and around certain types of technology, and the mobile aspect of technology and people moving on to the internet from an e-commerce perspective has happened in that time. So I think that's an interesting aspect. You know, enabling people to query an industry and ask it different types of questions apart from it being the cheapest is going to be a key enabler for us to have better outcomes from our commercial processes. So that's it for me. Some mega trends, some food for thought, some things to sprinkle into our discussion, into the Q&A. But and thank you.
Gosh, thank you very much, Neil. A very big perspective, I guess, on digital transformation, pulling from other industries, always really, really helpful. I really liked your example actually around, or your prediction around collaborative robotics in B&Q. But given that we're already talking about, you know, IKEA providing flat packed homes, you know, perhaps these things are really not too far away. So
exactly.
yeah, thank you very much indeed. Really fascinating. So thank you, all our speakers. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Emma Jane. Thank you, Hannah, for getting us thinking about these issues on how we get the best from our consultants. We have quite a number of questions coming through now, and I'd encourage you, please, all to post your questions. I'm actually going to start with a question which is, I guess, sort of the big picture, really, all about purpose. And I think all three of you touched on this. And the question really is, linking in, applying technology to what is the purpose of what we're doing. And I know all three of you have touched on the sort of values-based piece for consultancy, but perhaps you can help us understand a little bit more about how these different models might help us getting to that question about what's the actual need from a societal point of view, or perhaps from a client point of view as well. And maybe if I start that with Hannah, are you good to start with that one? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, interesting, challenging question to start with. Thank you, Lara. So, I mean, so in terms of, yeah, I think what it does is give us the opportunity to draw a better line of sight between the outcomes that the client is articulating and actually what it is that we are delivering for them. And what I mean by that is, if you've got previously, it would have been, I think, quite difficult to say, you know, through this commission, I want to increase social value. But actually, I think we've now got the ability to be able to demonstrate that in how we deliver versus delivering a very similar thing, but in a way that doesn't increase social value. So I think it's actually about the kind of measurement and articulation as much as it is about actually shifting what we do. But in being able to kind of measure our impact in a better way, it should mean, in theory, that we can then learn from it, because previously there might have been things that were well received by a client, but if you didn't have that sort of measurable performance, say, well, they were well received because actually we, you know, could measure the amount of social impact was much greater on this commission versus the one we did last year for the same client. I think, you know, you would never sort of be able to do that kind of self-reflection and say, well, what are the things that we can learn from that? How should we take that back into our business? So yeah, I think it's all about measurement and learning ourselves, but also being able to demonstrate that performance to the clients.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Emma Jane, I wondered whether you also might have a perspective on this. It sort of came out a little bit in what you said. Yeah,
sure. I mean, Hannah, I think, covered that really well. I suppose I would just add that from my perspective on the societal impact piece, I think that's, you know, that's come to the fore more and more. That's a really difficult area where we desperately need to combine skill sets to come up with some of those really tricky answers. And I suppose just on a simple level, getting to that understanding and then getting to that value in terms of how that value translates through the design of the asset or how we build that particular asset or intervention. We'll need the space to innovate and for those different skills to come together to come up with the answer. So I think my simple go at that very complex question you've set for question number one would be, because it sets the right space to enable the thinking.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Emma Jane. Neil, there is a question that's been directed very specifically at you, and maybe, I mean, it is quite a specific question, but given that the UK exports expertise to other countries as well, the question is about how digital transformation might benefit not just the developing world and perhaps the world that we're sitting in here in the UK, but also some of the undeveloped countries and the other countries in which we might be working in as well.
Yeah, interesting question. You know, from a construction innovation hub perspective, you know, we've done an awful lot of work with countries that are, I mean, maybe not developed countries, but countries that are joined the digital transformation from a government perspective a few years ago, and the outcomes of implementing BIM into their procurement processes on their public capital works. So, for example, in Mexico, you know, just a simple thing of the level, like the improving transparency in those types of governments, really key. And I think an interesting thing, especially for governments in those particular quadrants of the world where they're able to leapfrog. So there's an awful lot of how can we call it? You know, if you're a developed economy, there's a lot of inertia in terms of making change in a supply chain. So I think in these other parts of the world, what we will find, and my thoughts on this is that they will accelerate quite quickly and they'll catch up. And we've seen that, you know, if we look at what's happening with just applications on the internet, a lot of these companies are now not coming from Silicon Valley where all this stuff was born. You know, we look at things like TikTok and the technology that's emerging from India, for example. These hotbeds of technology are happening. So sorry that I keep going back to the internet, but I think it's a good litmus test for us to see that those dynamics, there's a difference between coming up with it and implementing it in your context. And you know, they haven't got many barriers, so I think it will happen very quickly. And you know, and the final point in terms of the exportation of that, it's quite interesting. You know, if you take the digital elements of the work that we do, it's borderless and it's applied to its context. And I think we're talking about the broader social context. So in terms of maximizing welfare for citizens, let's just take two simple ones: maximizing welfare for citizens and the climate change emergency that we find ourselves in. You know, you know, we need these technologies to bring us together to coordinate on that, and they need to use those tools to be able to coordinate because it's you know from a UK perspective we can fix it for ourselves, but what impact would that have on the globe is negligible. So influencing that's really key.
Thank you very much, Neil. Hannah, you might have some thoughts on this. I know ACE, you know, have some positioning around exporting expertise from the UK elsewhere. I don't know if you wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, I'm just a yes, very short kind of comment from me. Something that we've looked at when we've compared what our members are good at versus, you know, our competitors on a global stage. We were amongst the first countries to be industrialized as part of the Industrial Revolution. So we have got, I think, quite a lot of expertise in that sort of operational phase. So on my diagram that I showed, the little triangle, you're up in the kind of strategic advisory and the operations, because we are having to encounter a lot of those challenges with aging infrastructure, with changing political dynamics, maybe first compared to other countries. So I think, to my mind, that's what we should be exporting, is the top two parts of the triangle. How do you offer the best advice at a system level to make the right interventions? And how do you work out what those right interventions are from looking at the operations of the existing system? So those are the areas where I think we've really got something to add. And in turn, for, you know, developing countries, actually, you can make a hell of a lot more impact on value for investment if you focus in those areas rather than get fixated on delivering the wrong project a lot better. So that should be our exports, I think.
Lovely, thanks very much, Hannah. Two very different answers to a similar sort of question. It shows the complexity of this topic. There's a question here which perhaps, Emma Jane, I can direct at you first. So the question is, given the issues in public procurement of ensuring value for money, how can the public sector clients appoint the best initial strategic team to properly set up a project for success?
This is a great question, and it's a really important one, because, you know, all of our governance comes back to value for money, the understanding of it, and how we evidence, quite rightly, that we have procured well and that we've secured good bang for our buck for taxpayers. I think we come unstuck when that becomes all about just one capital of the model, financial capital. And we try to sort of explain everything in terms of typically short-term monetization. It is one consideration, but it should only be one consideration in a broader mix of value. And I know that the value toolkit goes a long way to talking about this and addressing it, but there remains more work to be done to define how other capitals in that capital model can be defined, and how we get natural capital and human capital on a same par with that financial capital, and how we develop the currencies for definition, such that we then, and actually I should say that the changes to the regs that are going through at the moment with the change from meet to match should go some way to helping this, because we will move from, with the economics sort of being taken out of there, we will move to a definition of most advantageous, which should lend itself more readily to a mix of capitals. So I think it's about recognising that, defining that, putting real time and effort into educating various stakeholders on what that looks like. And then the specific question is, how can public sector clients appoint the best initial strategic team to properly system project success? Well, I think that's about getting the advice in early and thinking about the stakeholders and thinking about how that can be evidenced and communicated really well.
Wonderful, thank you very much. A lot to think about there. Hannah or Neil, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that piece around how we set up the teams early on, and perhaps Hannah, you know, reflecting on, you know, those different models, you know, perhaps, you know, bringing some of those to life in that early stage, conceptual stage of projects.
Yeah, so I'm probably going to refer a little bit back to what Emma Jane said in her presentation around knowing yourself as a client, knowing where you want to kind of set that boundary, because early on, you know, you need to make some decisions about whether or not, for example, you are wedded to a particular type of solution. Have you committed that you are going to construct something, and therefore you could form that will give you a bit of a steer for the strategic team. So I think that's an important factor in understanding what you want from a strategic team. But then moving on from that, I think there is a piece about making sure that you are fully aware of what the market can offer. So, you know, it's particularly if you're a repeat business type client, you know, this is another one through the sausage machine. And therefore I'll just go with the strategic team in the same way that I have for the 300 other projects that we've delivered. I think because the consultancy market is evolving quite quickly, you do really need to sort of be out there and be quite visible, but also, you know, in listening mode as a client at the moment, because you will miss opportunities if you're not kind of opening your mind to some of the really interesting things that we've got around, you know, being able to model differently, being able to sort of help you with your decision-making process slightly differently. So yeah, just I think conversation with the market. Don't think that you necessarily know it all, because it is changing quite fast.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Go on, Neil, sorry.
So, and I think one of the things I wanted to link back to was what Hannah was saying in her presentation, was this, you know, the things that the industry is asked to deliver, and what how do they manifest? Because at this time it is and it's still based upon, digital bits of paper, essentially PDFs of things. Even across most consultancy type services, there's a point in time, and it's either, is it a PowerPoint deck? Is it a report? Is it a drawing? Is it a spreadsheet? And we haven't moved over into, work around objects, or work around, instead of in a feasibility study being given a report on the output of that, or a video or something, it's the model in which that thing is simulated and how you access that. And the cost dynamics of that is completely different, because in the delivering paper world, it is, clever people doing smart things, making these things presentable and communicatable via digital bits of paper. When that changes to querying data, providing outputs from a thing that's more dynamic, it's just like cliche, but it's like a dashboard or some other mode of querying data sets. It completely changes. The cost base of that is completely different. There is a computing element of it. There is a hosting the data perspective and the maintenance of that, and it flips the cost dynamics. So just where are some of the questions about that are coming up around, what are the expectations around information and data, and it's moving away from procuring reports to buying data is a big leap.
So that is a fantastic segue into a conversation or a question about skills. And I guess, there is this big question, so we're talking about changing consultancy offerings, getting closer to that need, use of data and technology. The question is, well, what does that mean in terms of skills required both in the consultant organisations, but actually also in the client organisations? I don't know I suspect everybody's got a perspective on this and an answer to this. I don't know who wants to go first. Who's going to dive in there first? Neil, do you want? Oh, go on, Hannah, you go.
Right, I'll go. No. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. So we did our piece of research last year on the future of the workplace, and rather than talk about particular skills disciplines, because I know people can wax lyrical about data scientists and modelers and coders and things. I think that's all fine, and maybe Neil, you will talk in a more informed way than I will about that in a minute. I think if you take a step back, it's actually about a shift in the types of people that you need, and particularly the roles that they perform. So what I'm quite interested in is the shift from predominantly having a vast number of people delivering solutions into having technology that can deliver the solutions, and having the people doing the value adding part of understanding what the problems are that the client is facing, and being able to bring together the right experts and the right technology solutions to solve those particular problems. So I think actually what we're going to see is, rather than, I said, I'm not going to touch on sort of competence skills. I think actually the skill set is around the level at which you work, So we'll see a lot more sort of, consultants focusing on people who have really good lateral thinking capabilities, because actually what we want is the person being the glue that sort of brings all of the really good technical stuff together. So I think it's a bit more of a shift in how you might deploy the resources, which in turn might mean that you need different people, or you may need to, reskill some of your existing people, give them additional skill sets. But I think it's a bit more complex than just saying we're going to need fewer engineers and a lot more data scientists.
Thanks, Hannah. Emma Jane, in your 3 pieces, your know thyself, have a plan, and know the expertise, there's definitely a theme there around skills. I don't know whether you want to add anything onto what Hannah's already said about this.
Yeah, I like Hannah, I'm not sure how useful it would be to start talking about competencies, although clearly that is a very big piece of this jigsaw in understanding, some of the answers and the challenges that we have. I'll probably make 2 observations. The first is in my 3 sort of readouts, the commonality from a skills perspective across all 3 of those are what we would have traditionally called, and it's a bit irritating that we call it this, but the softer skills. And it's sort of linked to Hannah's sort of lateral piece. There is there's a set of skills that enables us to be joining dots, working together, being flexible. I don't have better words than that, but there's something in that in terms of a skill set of that's how we will make possible this sort of mix of skills that now need to come together in the creation of outcomes and different performance based, rather than that linear sort of traditional skill against discipline type approach. And then another observation I would make is that it's something to do with the pace of change of skill over the past decade or so, because clearly that pace will continue, if not exponentially increase. And so I think there's something around culturally getting our heads around, whether that's client and consultant or together, that nothing is static, and actually the pace of this change will continue to evolve, and perhaps we need to be investing in skills and investing in people in a way that gets them comfortable with that, encourages that, embraces it, so that careers are based around an evolving picture, making possible all of those different technological advancements.
Wonderful. Neil, I suspect you might have a view on skills. Interestingly, one of the things that I've heard talked about is digital literacy, and people talk about some of those softer skills within that context of digital literacy. But I don't know whether you're able also to comment on some of perhaps the sort of more technical hard competencies that might be required as well. I don't.
Hannah said an awful lot that I was going to say, so caught me onto it there. But I think so. There's a couple of interesting things. So one is, and I guess the analogy is for me to learn something. Let's say I wanted to go and learn how to code something. It's all, I mean, I'd imagine most people on this call use Excel. The amount of times that I Google something about an Excel function is quite frequent. So the expertise of using Excel is less about remembering how to use Excel and more about how do I ask the internet on how to use Excel. But I don't worry about how the internet works. I just know that there's a place I can go and I can find things really quickly. So I think there's this shift in our learning style that is more accepting about learning on the job. And I think we all, we traditionally do a lot of learning on the job, because the type of things that we build are generally bespoke and first time, and we're always learning as we go along. And it's more of embracing that. So I don't think there's, from the foundation of what we learn about in the industries doesn't change. I think what's different is, the skills that we do need is that broader design aspect from service and service design, process design, still something that we would have thought would be more prevalent, but is still we think about a major role of how a consultant gets moving on a piece of work. That process engineering piece is really key. And then lastly is the skills around data, but there's a difference between data, I suppose, data science and statistics, and I think people get mixed up on it. Like the interpretation of data and how machines communicate with each other are two different things. And I think in terms of the two vital skills, I think industry gets those two things mixed together. I think the interface with the data, where we have our very clever people that exist in the industry already, that user interface of that is the thing that changes, not necessarily the people themselves. And it's being what they should expect from data and what it means is is really key. But the emerging, I say emerging, it's not emerging, it's here and established, it's here today, is, you know, that machine to machine communication piece is a key area for focus.
Thanks, Neil. Great answers to that skills question. Thank you very much. We cannot get through a webinar on this topic without talking about data. And you've now raised it, Neil, so I'm actually going to ask this question here that's all about data, but it's actually from the perspective of how we might organise it, particularly data that is owned by the clients, organising that data so that actually we can help and support clients drive insight. And the question is, how can data, client data be organised so that simpler insights become obvious to enable better decisions? And maybe in the context actually of some of these models that we're talking about, so how do consultants support that process of data, you know, providing insight through large data sets? I don't know who wants to go with that first. Neil, is this something that you're itching to talk about?
Yeah, and I guess there's I kind of covered some of it, but there's two parts of that. One is you know, we're not collecting data for data's sake. So I guess from a buyer's perspective is being completely clear about the purpose of the data, which you know, a thing here to remember is there was a point in time where, you know, when you were tendering for a piece of work, it was once limited by how much you can fit in the post. One of the disadvantages of the internet is that when we come to bidding for work, you know, client organizations will just send you every single piece of information and say, can you price this for us? Yeah, it includes all the outside information that isn't contextual for you. So clients being smarter about providing information to the right people with the purposes of that will be key, because you can get smarter questions coming back. You buy better quality data. The other side of that in terms of structuring it is then also, you know, as I go back to talking about the outputs moving from bits of paper to data flows or queries on data, is making sure that there's a quality element to the thing that you're buying, and it's being pointed towards that, and not the, you know, I expect a piece of paper to be emailed to me at this date, to I expect to know something about this object. You know, talk about hospitals, for example. You know, I want to know, you know, the capacity of this hospital, and I want to know it to this level of detail, and I expect to know that by this date. Is that it's might sound like the same thing, but the technical structure of the data is fundamentally different, and you have to be completely clear about what it is that you need from that to understand from an insight perspective.
And Neil, just building on that, I guess, you know, sort of data architecture and the ability to form those data sets, which you know, clearly historically have been formed perhaps in the silos that they were originally intended. I don't know from the perspective of, you know, the relationship between consultants and, you know, clients, whether, you know, that's something that you see a lot happening at the moment, you know, being able to formulate and create those those systems and architectures so that actually insight can be
trying to not get into the sort of the noughts and ones, but to jump in a little bit deeper. So, you know, for example, the semantic search that you have on Google requires something called a knowledge graph, and, you know, client organizations are going, you know, some of them are going through this process of understanding what is the knowledge graph of the data that they have, and what that means is that they understand the interdependencies of the data that's connected together. You know, when you ask, when you type into Google, it's a question, you'll notice now that it doesn't actually provide it will provide you web pages that have those terms in there, but at the top, if you ask it about a person, it will pull together a profile about, you know, here's a picture of that person, and a series of different web sources that bring it all together. And that's really key. Sort of, let's call it database design, but it's that's a key piece. That's where we are in that maturity curve, is sort of understanding, you know, it's not just about data structure, it's the relationship of those pieces of data is key.
Thank you, Neil. Emma Jane, you might have a view on on data usefulness or otherwise of data streams and being able to help make decisions.
Well, my view is probably a very simple one. And in a way, it's a good thing, because I am a client and I am hugely dependent on the experts to help me in this space, because I have no idea. And I suppose the only input I would give is that I think it's really important to think about it and talk about it early and to look at options early, because in that way we can design in the automation and the right data points that will help run a program really efficiently. And I am probably quite typical of many other clients in that space. So I think, you know, accepting it's something that needs to be talked about early on rather than sort of broad brush added in once you sort of set up your structures and contracts later on is something that doesn't work.
Wonderful. So there you go, an opportunity for some consultants to really help shape some of those conversations. Thank you, Emma Jane. I think we have got time for one last question. And again, I guess you can't get through something like this without the B word coming up. And I think we do need to ask the question. So there is one question that's come in around Brexit. And the question is, does Brexit allow UK public procurement rules to be changed to better buy for value? I don't know whether, it's not my area of expertise. I don't know if anybody has a view on this.
I'm happy to start us off.
Thanks, Emma Jane.
Well, I mean, look, the procurement regs at the moment are right for consultation. And in fact, actually, it may well be today, the last few hours, where they're taking feedback. I think it is. And rightly or wrongly, that's been seen as an opportunity to change those regs. And as I've alluded to earlier, I'll make it a short response because I know we've only got a couple of minutes. The change from meet to mat I find quite exciting. And it is a real opportunity for us to do something more substantial in that space around the advantageous piece and really define what we think that looks like in terms of a broader societal value. So I think really good opportunity for UK procurement. Yeah.
Thanks, Emma Jane. Hannah.
Yeah, so I think it's a good opportunity. I'm struggling to get too excited about it, to be honest, because I think there are bigger challenges. I think there are challenges around client capability, notwithstanding Emma Jane, because I think she's amazing. But I think there are challenges around client capability to get to grips with, and to be able to get the right data and the right benchmarking. You can't go to something more sophisticated that's not financial unless you've got better data to back it up, because the consultants won't take the commercial risk if they don't trust your data, and you leave yourself open to legal challenge. So yes, in theory it's exciting, but I still think there's a long way to go to actually making it a reality. Sorry, that's really negative to end a webinar, but there we go.
I guess it was me who asked the Brexit question, so I asked for it. Thank you very much, Hannah. And I think we're probably just about out of time, so I think we'll wrap up. What an incredibly informative and diverse conversation about getting the best from consultants. I hope it's been interesting and informative for everybody who joined the call, and thank you very much for joining us. And thank you enormously to our three panelists, Hannah, Emma Jane and Neil, for their presentations and for expertly answering that diverse group of questions. We will send everybody who's attended the recording of the webinar and the presentation slides in the next few days, so you'll have those and you can access them through the ACE website as well. On screen, we've just flicked up the details of two of the upcoming Future of Consultancy webinars on Wednesday the 24th of March and Tuesday the 13th of April. And the people that will be involved in those, please do sign up for those. They're all free, as you know, and available to open to anybody in the industry who's interested. So all that's left for me to do is to thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you found it really useful, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Have a super day and a super week. Take care. Cheers. Bye now.